They called her a thief before anyone learned the baby's name. Rain had been sowing itself into the night for hours, turning the hedges of the Harper estate into wet, dark curtains, and the long gravel drive into a slick ribbon under Maya Williams's shoes. She moved with the practiced economy of someone who kept a house running on little sleep and little pay, sweeping, folding, remembering to tuck a towel under a pot that always leaked. The night staff had finished their rounds. The house was quiet, except for the hum of a generator and the distant hush of the city. Maya was finishing a last check of the service entrance when something cut through the air, a cry so small and raw it sounded like it might break. At first she thought it was a cat, then a shudder, then the wind. The sound came again, a thin keening from behind the row of green bins, muffled by the plastic lid and the rain. Maya's heart narrowed. The sound belonged to a human throat, not adult, not animal, a baby. She moved without thinking, the way mothers move, forward, hands out, the world narrowing. The rain found the collar of her coat and ran down to warm the cotton at her wrist. The smell was of wet cardboard and cooking oil when she lifted the lid, and then a shock of something else, faint breath, the soft packing of a tiny body wrapped in a blanket, the slow staccato chatter of life hanging by a thread. The infant was wet and small, no bigger than a loaf of bread, curled inside a stained knitted blanket with a faded elephant embroidered near the hem. Her face was the color of the inside of a shell, her lips blue at the edges. She was alive, but barely. Maya's hands trembled when she scooped her up. The blanket was cold against her skin. Rainwater pooled in the seams of the trash can and trickled off the baby's hair. "Hold on," Maya whispered, the words happening without formality. She pressed the infant to her chest, folding the woman's coat around the tiny body like a makeshift incubator. The baby's breath was shallow. Each inhale sounded like the soft click of wood. Maya could feel the flutter of ribs beneath wet fabric. A story lived in her ribs now, an awareness that this small life would either keep breathing because someone chose to help, or the night would smooth itself over and pretend nothing had ever happened. She wrapped the blanket tighter, fingers finding a small plush elephant in the folds, its embroidered eye hanging on by a thread. Maya cradled the toy like a prophecy. She turned toward the house, toward the garage lights that burned like beacons, toward humanity. Rain plastered hair to her face and ran down her neck. Her breath came quick, not from the climb of the service steps, but from the urgency that had threaded itself into her bones. Inside the kitchen wing, movements multiplied like a chorus. A door swung open with a metallic clack. A night guard, one of the newer hires, saw her at the back door and raised his hand.
Paperwork, check-in, the household cold viruses of protocol. Maya didn't think about protocol. She pushed past the guard, shouting for help, for towels, for someone who knew what to do. By the time she reached the main corridor, the house had blurred into a series of urgent figures. A woman in a robe, mascara streaked, clutching a phone. A man in a tailored coat who moved like a storm. The woman cried out when she saw the child, fingers flying to her mouth. Maya felt hands reach for the baby, an involuntary defense of the small body she'd wrapped in shelter. Then arms stronger and surer than hers took the infant away. Thomas Harper had the baby's face in his hands before anyone in the kitchen had finished forming the word cold. He could not be accused of not loving his child. He had funding for every cure, private doctors, therapists. He had a face the cameras loved and a voice trained for explanation. He did not think first of the baby when he saw her. He thought of the consequence, the rupture, the optics. Then the man saw the child was alive, and something like terror unclenched his jaw. "They left her?" His voice was a tool, sharp and steady. "They abandoned my daughter?" It was Vanessa Harper who named the accusation out loud. Her hair was pinned in a messy chignon, mascara streaked. She looked as if she had been bright, and that brightness had been squeezed out. Her voice was a machine made to move blame, quick, efficient, thin in the places regret would later fill. "She was in the trash," Vanessa said. "A servant did this. Someone must have—" A hush fell, because naming a villain makes the world coherent again. The house waited for an explanation that would smooth and secure it. Eyes found Maya and did not look away. She stood small in the doorway, the soaked blanket draped around her arms, and a thread of rain sliding down her face. She had saved that child. She had reached into the dark and found life. She had acted like somebody's mother, and now her gesture of rescue was reframed as theft, as trespass, as the unforgivable crossing of a line that belonged to a family who wanted only to keep their surfaces unblemished. "You brought her out of the trash." The question came as accusation. Maya heard the words as if from far away. She wanted to say yes and to be finished with it, to let someone else take her mistake and fix it. Instead, she said, "She's cold. She's breathing." "What were you doing near the bins?" a man demanded. The head of household security, perhaps, his posture engineered to convey suspicion rather than concern. The question wasn't an invitation to explain. It was a settlement. His eyebrows met and made a dividing line. Maya could have shown the tangled blanket, the tiny elephant, the dampness that traced the baby's ear. She could have climbed back outside and pointed to the spot by the hedges where she'd lifted the child. Instead, hands closed around the baby, and the tone of the room turned.
People in suits arrive at the scene of a possible scandal with the instincts of containment. There are steps: retrieve, sequester, explain. Nothing in that sequence included telling the truth of a rescuer who was not supposed to be seen. Guards ushered Maya into the pantry and closed the door. The air there tasted of powdered sugar and cleaning acid. A chair scraped the tile as someone sat across from her, an officer from the private security detail, not the police yet, but unofficial law with a smile like a blade. They spoke to a phone, to a lawyer on the end of a call. The narrative began to acquire confidence. A servant, alone near the trash, a child taken from the property. It had the smell of convenience. "How did you get inside, exactly?" the officer asked, his voice diplomatic. Maya's hands had stopped shaking. She looked down at the infant's small chest, rising and falling, like a whispered agreement. "I heard a baby," she said. "She was in the bin. I don't know where who?" "When did you find this child?" another voice demanded from the doorway. Detective Claire Monroe stood there, her coat still dotted with rain, eyes like a ledger that read people for what they had to offer the case. She had the look of someone who had seen inconvenient truths and kept them on a short leash. Maya looked up at the detective with the simple insistence of someone calling for help. "Tonight, she was blue. She was so cold, I thought." The sentence broke. She had never been so plain before. Her voice found something that felt new and honest in the kitchen's antiseptic air. Detective Monroe's gaze slayed toward the baby in the arms of the man who had declared himself father. She spoke to Maya with a voice that was careful and practical. "We're going to take a report," she said. "Medical attention first." The pediatrician at the emergency room moved with the cool urgency of someone trained to choose between breath and breath. The baby was tiny, her body shivering beneath thin hospital blankets, her skin mottled with cold. The doctor said the word hypothermia, clinical, precise. It was the kind of word that turned a human into a case, and yet it also kept a hand on the child's body, monitoring, coaxing. They checked for reflex, checked for tone, warmed her with towels and with the small, steady instrument of experienced hands. A nurse wrapped the little elephant more carefully than it deserved, pressing it to the child's belly like a charm. They gave the infant a name in the functionary language of the hospital, infant unknown, admitted under the temporary care of the city. Maya, who had not thought to name the child, found the syllable Ella bristling up from somewhere inside her, soft, round, a sound like offering. She said it aloud once, very quietly, as if the name might be taken by saying it. When the nurse looked at her, there was a flicker of permission. Names make things real.
At the hospital, press vans had begun to ring the edges of the lot like vultures. Someone from Harper's communications team had already deployed a statement. Shock, cooperation with authorities, immediate removal from the home of anyone suspected. The family wanted their privacy respected, they said. It read as a plea and a wedge. Reporters asked about a servant. A cameraman asked about responsibility. The night spun itself into blurred frames of headlines and hashtags. Within hours, Maya's life had narrowed to two things: the baby's shallow breaths and the weight of suspicion. She had done the only thing she could imagine doing, that is, saving a life, and she was being treated as if she had stolen it. Back at the estate, the tides of reaction were swift. The accused, Maya, was dismissed from service. It was framed as a preemptive measure, for the household's protection, they said, and to assist investigators. In the language of the house, where the top floors were polished and the service wings kept their own rules, dismissal was practical. In the life of the dismissed person, dismissal was a removal of identity, a sudden invisibility. Maya left with the damp blanket still tucked under her arm, the elephant in her pocket, and the photo she carried against her chest, an old, creased photograph of Lorraine Williams, her mother, in uniform, smiling shyly at the life that had always been only partly her own. They marched her to the grounds and closed a shed door behind her like a time lock. The shed smelled of oil and old wood. It was small, concrete underfoot, and humbling in its silence. Someone said they were waiting for police, that this was temporary. Maya sat on a damp bench and pressed the photo into her palm until the paper went warm from body aid. Lorraine's eye looked back at her with something like a challenge. Remember who you are. Maya repeated that to herself the way a chant. Remember who you are. Remember who you are. The police took their statements. There were careful questions. When, where, what did she touch? And there was the undercurrent of a narrative waiting to be filled out. The Harper family's lawyer visited with eyes polished by public relations. His words were not kind. They were strategic. Someone suggested police might need to consider charges for theft if the narrative of a servant taking a child stuck. The thought felt absurd, and yet it landed with the weight of a new possible future. Detective Claire Monroe was not the kind of officer who moved with the crowd. She asked precise questions in a voice that did not condescend. Who saw you go to the bins? Did anyone see you take the child? She asked. Maya's memory spread thin in the bright hospital light. She could remember only the rain, the lid, the soft rustle of the blanket, and the way the child's eyes fluttered. She had been alone. Is there security footage? Maya asked. The words stayed in her mouth as if survival awaited it. Detective Monroe's jaw tightened.
There is supposed to be, she said. But right now, she paused in a way that let a practical worry hang in the air like laundry. Someone's recorded feed was overwritten overnight. The main camera shows only static for that hour. Maya's lungs caught. That sentence rearranged everything. If there had been a camera, if the night had a witness in pixels and light, why had it failed? The house had people whose job was to keep a family safe. Cameras were hired to do that. For the first time, the idea of the incident as a simple mistake became complex. Someone had tampered, or someone had been careless. Either way, the absence of footage put Maya in the place where rumor and desire could rewrite the event. When the first headlines hit, they had the headline's usual appetite for neatness. Infant found on Billionaire's estate, servant questioned, read one top line. The photograph used in an early broadcast cut to Maya's face long enough for strangers to guess culpability. The story's frame was clean and cruel. The rich, the scandal, the accused servant. No one wanted to complicate that frame with a detail that did not sit comfortably in the narrative. Greta's house was a small, stubborn refuge 3 blocks down from where the city forgot people. It sat on a corner and had a garden that was almost fierce in its insistence on color. Maya went there with a blanket and a receipt for her last paycheck and the elephant toy that kept falling out of her pocket, and Greta opened the door like someone who had waited. Child? Greta's face folded into the news, then softened at bread left too long in the oven. She wrapped Maya in her arms because that was what she did. Come in, love. Tell me everything. Greta listened without interruption, her hands clenching and unclenching the way people do when anger and fear pass through them. Her house smelled of rosemary and fried onions, and something sweet at the back of the oven. The radio in the kitchen hissed with fragments of footage, with anchors measured curiosity about who might have placed a child in a trash can. Maya folded into a chair like a person aware of failing. When she told Greta about the shed, about being locked in, about the security feed showing static, Greta's mouth fenned into a line that spoke of understanding and outrage in equal measure. They wanted to erase you, she said. They wanted a story without you in it. Greta had words for structural things that were hard to name but easy to feel. She taught Maya how to keep her spine like something unbreakable, how to hold her voice in a place that refused to be swallowed. There was a kindness in Greta's small gestures that felt like suturing to a wound, a bowl of soup, fresh towels, a room with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. She made phone calls. She brought over blankets that were not stained with the estate's dirt. She insisted that Maya rest.
But she did not fix the problem of the missing footage or the way the city's gossip had already written Maya into a story that might not let her go. Days turned into a slow grinding of interviews and forms. Supporters arrived in small numbers, neighbors who remembered Maya's careful ways at the block's community garden, a woman from the church who dropped off bread. Detective Monroe stayed a discreet distance while doing the work of her job, cross-referencing statements, poking holes where a narrative was too neat. She found inconsistencies in the Harper's timeline that made her frown, and the frown was honest currency. We need witnesses, she said plainly. If there was tampering with the feed, we need someone who can tell us when, why, and who had access. It was Darnell who offered a first light. He had worked in maintenance for the Harpers for years. He was the kind of man who had a key to places others couldn't imagine.
He appeared like a shadow with a face at Greta's kitchen table, his voice low as if the world was still listening. "I saw something," he said. He slid a folded slip of paper across the table. The note had a thumbprint smudge and 3 words: "Check the backup." Maya looked at Darnell the way someone looks at a door that might just open. "What backup?" she asked. He leaned forward. "There are 2 feeds. The backup goes to a hard drive in the maintenance shed. I checked it once when the system choked. Files sometimes save there. I didn't go through everything, but I copied something out once I saw the timestamp." His eyes were steady. "I didn't want to get caught. They'd have fired me in a heartbeat, but you can't let a child be trampled under their machine." The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Greta set down a mug she hadn't quite finished. Maya's fingers closed around the elephant toy until the thread of its eye dug into her palm. Detective Monroe's face took on an edge of something like relief when Darnell spoke, but it was not simple. "Any footage has to be authenticated," she said, "and if someone tampered with the main feed, the defense will lean on that. We'll need witnesses to corroborate anything Darnell brings us, and there's always the matter of chain of custody." Those words were the practical coldness of justice. They meant evidence could not merely be shown, it had to be proven to have been preserved properly. Darnell nodded. He had worked with cameras in his job. "I made a copy," he said. "I didn't give it to anyone. I was scared." His eyes flicked to Maya. "But I looked. It shows a figure near the bins. It wasn't you." Maya's stomach dropped and lifted at once. Probability was not a kindness. It did not transform accusation into absolution, but Darnell's claim lodged in her like a splinter of possibility. Maya had reasons to be careful.
She remembered the first time she'd held a paying job in a house that glittered, and had learned quickly that the well-dressed people above the stair railing always saw the service wing through their own filters. There was a ledger for everything, a list of acceptable grievances, a line where pay could be stopped, a protocol for dismissal. She had learned to keep her back straight and her voice small and clear. That was how she had survived. That is how she had kept her childlike acts of care from becoming things that would be used as evidence against her. The smear on social media moved like mold, silent until it was not. Anonymous accounts speculated, opinion pieces posited motives. The hedge fund of public will favored the family who had money and status. Narratives that fit that frame did not trouble their edges for long. In some corners of the internet, headlines reduced Maya to an archetype, the threatening outsider who had overstepped. People whose hands never touched a broom issued verdicts. Maya sat at Greta's kitchen table while the chatter of the world tried to rehearse its version of the truth. She had enough of an idea of how power spun that she understood what she would be up against. A narrative machine that moved faster than evidence could, a team of lawyers who could shape doubt, and the slow, cold work of assembling proof. It was not a clean battle. It was a long one. "You're not going to let them make you small," Greta said, and the sentence was more prayer than prediction. "You walked through the rain for a baby, and you won't let them write your story as anything else." Maya closed her eyes and let the old photograph of Lorraine press against her chest. Lorraine's smile in that creased picture was all the steadiness Maya had. Her mother had worked in houses like the Harpers all her life. Lorraine had taught Maya how to iron badly folded cuffs, how to boil greens so they tasted like home, and how to keep your shoulders from crumbling when someone else told you your worth. There were threads between the Harpers and her family, small, shaky threads she had not wanted to examine, but the world had a way of drawing them out until you had to look. When Darnell left, he pressed his hand to Maya's shoulder in a way that suggested promise and also a warning. "If I get caught," he muttered, "they'll make an example. But there are people who know. Otis saw something from the gardener's shed. Camila, the assistant, she's upset. She said she heard Vanessa on a call. The names accumulated like stones that might strengthen a bridge if piled correctly." Maya felt the pile of stones grow under her feet, small and heavy but buildable. She held her daughter's elephant and listened to the practicalities spin out. Someone could authenticate the backup if it was given to a lab, if there was chain of custody, if the DA decided the case warranted the trouble.
There were steps, and each step required courage, and each step carried the threat of retaliation. Lawyers with polished smiles, PR teams practiced in erasing human messiness, private security with budgets for intimidation. "Do you want me to find a lawyer?" Greta asked. Her voice was the steady thing that had been waiting through the whole of the night. Maya folded the blanket around Ella with care, feeling the warmth that came from being held, and thought of other things she had to hold. Her reputation, the tiny demands of daily survival,
a history of being seen as less than who she was. She had never wanted to be a public person. She had never wanted to be a cause. She wanted to keep a baby warm. But the world had its own plan for people who refused to be invisible. "Yes," she said finally. Her voice was softer than she had known it could be, and steadier for its softness. "If we can make them look, then maybe they'll have to see." Detective Monroe filed reports with a face that kept reading different angles. She had her own reckonings with power. "The feed going dark isn't an accident we can ignore," she said. "If Darnell has maintained a copy, we need to secure it. We'll go through proper channels, evidence room, chain of custody. If somebody tried to wipe the tapes, that's obstruction." The words were both doctor and armor. Maya tucked them into herself like instructions. Things to do, things to demand. The first step had been to save a life. The second step was to protect herself and the child from a version of events that would make her the villain. For a moment, Thomas Harper sat alone in his study, while the house around him moved like a living thing trying to keep from being embarrassed. Papers lay in perfect stacks. Photographs in frames showed a man with a serious jaw and a gaze that suggested he had been chosen by fortune. He held the baby's hospital photo in his hands with both hands, the way a man holds a lit candle. He did not know why he felt an ache like grief that had nothing to do with the baby's immediate danger. It was pain that found its roots in memory. An old photograph of a young woman with her sleeves rolled up, Lorraine, hand in a glove that had known service. He thought of people who had been part of his household and had drifted into the background of his life, faces that had come and gone. For the first time since the ambulances left, he imagined the cost of things that were too easily dismissed. "Find out who left her there," he told his assistant later, but his voice had become a softer instrument. "And find out who is protecting that person." There was something human in the demand, a hunger for truth mixed with the impulse to control what the truth would look like. He wanted to know. He wanted to fix. He wanted to stop the news cycle. He wanted to make right again the image of his family.
It was a need with an edge. If a child could be found in a trash can, then the sensibility that had cocooned him all his life was not absolute. Darnell's message that a backup might exist floated between possibility and danger. Maya sat at Greta's kitchen table with the elephant in her hands and thought of the steps ahead. She was tired of being defined by where she worked, by the small, whitened corner of life designated for people like her. She thought of her mother and the photograph in her pockets, and of the way love, once made visible, kept asking to be seen. "If you want to fight," Greta said quietly, "we'll need people on your side, not just lawyers, people who saw, people who can stand up in court and tell the truth." Maya looked at the list they'd drawn up on a scrap of paper. Darnell, Otis, the gardener, Camilla, the assistant, names that felt like lifelines. She folded the scrap into her palm and felt it there. Weight, possibility, the first hard thing she had placed inside her fist since the night she found the baby. That night, Ella slept in a borrowed room at Greta's, under a blanket that smelled of soap and home. Maya sat up by the window, the city a smear of lights, and thought of the world that had already decided a story for her. She remembered the feel of the baby's tiny hand closing on her finger in the hospital, a grip so absolute it felt like a promise. If the world tried to make her small, she thought, she would resist not with spectacle, but with stubborn, steady action. She would find the people who had seen. She would follow the proofs. She would tell the truth and make it hard to deny. A folded piece of paper slid under Greta's back door the next morning like a footprint. Maya opened it with fingers that felt numb and read in a hurried scrawl, "I have a copy. Meet me tonight. Maintenance shed. Do not go alone." The note was small. It was the size of risk and of hope. Maya folded it back into her pocket and pressed it against the old photograph of Lorraine until the paper warmed. The world had a way of making small things into tests. Maya had just enough courage not to let fear be the last word. She would not let the baby be a ghost in some sanitized tale of mishap. She would not let the story end with her dismissal and a family statement. Outside, the city had already begun to whisper about names. Inside, a tiny life slept with a toy elephant pressed to her cheek. Maya tasted the rain in the memory of the night she had first heard the cry. She imagined the cameras and the lawyers, the defense teams rehearsing how to widen the space of doubt. She imagined Detective Monroe sitting with her ledger and watching the world work. But she also imagined Darnell on his knees in the shed, working with hardware that hummed with possibility. She imagined Otis standing near the hedges with his own silence finally cracking.
She imagined Camilla, young and nervous in heels, clutching an audio file that might ruin everything she had thought she knew about her employers. Maya held on to the photograph of Lorraine like a map. She had been invisible long enough to know how it felt. She had the baby in her arms, the elephant pressed to her palm, and the note in her pocket. She would go to the shed that night. She would meet the person who promised evidence. Visibility, she had decided, would be the way out. If this story is moving you, if you believe in the stubbornness of doing the right thing even when the world notices you for it, like and subscribe. The voices of people who have been ignored matter. Greta walked Maya to the bus stop and then back again, making sure she had gloves and a scarf and a second pair of shoes. Maya's palms felt rough as she held them. Her reflection in a shop window was a woman wrapped in a coat and responsibility. The maintenance shed at the back of the Harper property sat like an old spine behind the decorative facade, and Maya's steps were quiet because she did not want to be seen until she had to be. Darnell waited in the dim light inside, a hard drive in his hands like an offering and like a confession. The smell there was of oil and old tape. He looked like a man who had been working too hard for too little. "I wasn't sure," he said, "but I copied the file the night the main recorder had a glitch. It was a shadow. Not clear, but it's something. And Otis swears he saw Vanessa carrying a bundle that night. He said it was wrapped in a blanket." Maya listened. The words came in a rhythm like a drumbeat of possibility. There were holes in the story, grainy footage, shaky recollections, legal hurdles, but there was movement. The world had a way of making justice slow, but sometimes it also gave you the small bright moments people call chance. "Where did you hide the copy?" Detective Monroe asked quietly when she arrived, the badge on her belt going unnoticed in the dim shed. Darnell handed over the hard drive with a hand that trembled. "I copied it to a thumb drive," he said. "I kept it in a tin in my toolbox. I didn't tell no one. I couldn't risk it." The detective's expression softened in a way that did not undo the facts. "We'll take that and we will log it," she said. "It will go to the lab. We will do everything by the book." Maya watched them work, hands coordinated, careful. She had been in rooms where the machinery of the wealthy could always seem to run smoother than the machinery of the poor. This, she thought, might be the machine that could tilt a narrative if it was handled by people who cared about process more than image. When Darnell left, he did not hug Maya. He was from a place where humility kept the world from tearing you apart. He touched the side of his head and nodded, and then he vanished into the night. Maya's phone lit up with an unknown number.
She let it go to voicemail. When she checked later, there was a voice message from a woman named Camilla. Her voice was brittle, like glass in a pocket. "I shouldn't be calling," the message said. "But if Darnell has something, then you need to know. I overheard Vanessa. She said she put something where no one would find it, and she sounded like she meant it. If you can, trust someone. Be careful." The calls ended like the titles of old movies. Something and then a fade. Maya folded them into herself with the careful patience of someone learning to believe in other people's courage. So the work began. To collect witnesses, to authenticate a file, to build a chain. The city continued to murmur, and the Harpers continued to maintain a polished opacity. Headlines came and went, but within the opacity was a thread of truth, and Maya held the other end of it like an anchor. She had saved a life with her hands and her heart. Now she would see if those hands could thread a new story into the world, one that refused to write her as villain. She thought of Lorraine, of the photograph, of the way the kitchen light had caught the elephant's embroidered eye at the very beginning. She thought of Ella's breath, soft but steady now, and she let the rhythm of it fill the room like a promise. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night smelled of wet pavement and possibilities. Maya folded the note she had kept and slipped it into the pocket nearest her heart. The world was already deciding what to do with her, and she was deciding back. The hard drive did the quiet work of proof. In Detective Monroe's evidence locker, beneath a hum of fluorescent light, it became an object with a name, Exhibit B. Someone logged it into a ledger. Someone else photographed it. A technician wrapped it in a tamper-evident bag. Each small procedural move felt to Maya like a stitch being made. Necessary, deliberate, sometimes dull, but vital if a story was to hold together in daylight. The lab did not speak in declarations. It returned results in footnotes and cautious sentences. The backup footage was grainy, shadows and rain, a smear of movement rather than a clear face. The feed showed a figure approaching the row of bins at 11:42 p.m., a bundle wrapped tight. The angle was imperfect. The camera sat high, aimed along the driveway, and the figure's head never turned fully toward the lens.
Still, the silhouette's coat, the way the bundle was held, the gait of the person, small but certain, matched Otis's memory of a woman who moved with an aim he recognized. Defense lawyers could point to grain and ambiguity, and they did. They called the footage a murky thing whose meaning could be spun. But the prosecutor could point to process. Detective Monroe had Darnell's affidavit about the discovery and transfer of the file. Chain of custody was strict. The thumb drive had been photographed at each handoff. The lab had recorded timestamps and checksum files.
In court, the exhibition of methodology, each small step accounted for, did more than the footage alone might have done. It refused the convenient slipperiness of rumor. There were hurdles. The defense questioned Darnell under oath until the man's hands trembled and his voice went thin. They wanted to make him out as flaky, unreliable, someone who had tampered, someone who had motives, someone who could have manufactured evidence. They hinted that the maintenance worker had grievances, that he might seek a payday. They asked whether he had access to the main server, whether the backup could have been altered. The technique was old and precise. Plant a seed of doubt that kept jurors turning the soil in their mouths. Maya sat in the back of the courtroom in a plain coat, Ella asleep in a stroller beside her, the knitted blanket tucked across the child's knees, the elephant toy peeking from a pocket. She kept her hands folded so they did not tremble on cue. She had not wanted to be there like this, on display with a stroller and small acts of domestic care, but it had become unavoidable. The trial was not just about one evening. It had become a measurement of how a society accounted for who was seen and who was not. ADA Joel Bennett arrived like a man who had learned patience as a profession. He had a low voice for public rooms and a careful way of explaining complicated things simply. He spoke to Maya once before the trial, not with platitudes, but with a plan. "We can't promise anything," he said. "We can only promise we'll follow what the evidence allows. If we do our work, we'll have more than a story. We'll have corroboration." That word, corroboration, would anchor everything. The prosecution did not rely on a single piece of evidence. They had Darnell's backup footage, Otis's witness statement that he had seen Vanessa near the bins that night returning from the gardener's lane with something wrapped in cloth, Camila's audio file in which Vanessa's voice came through, brittle and private, saying, "I put it where no one would find it," and a forensic audio analysis that matched the patterns of Vanessa's speech against known voice samples taken in a prior deposition. Each piece on its own was vulnerable to dismissal. Together, they formed a pattern. Camila's decision to speak had an intimacy that mattered. She had not intended to become a witness in a case that would tear at her employer's life. She had recorded the call, initially only for her own memory, when Vanessa had ranted on the line to a friend about being overwhelmed, about mistakes and monsters. Camila had not imagined the recording would be needed in a courtroom. When she handed the file over, her hands were white-knuckled. She expected professional consequences. What she did not expect was the private relief of letting a truth out of a mouth that had rehearsed secrecy. Detective Monroe handled Camila's statement with careful respect.
The woman had been young and visibly nervous on the stand. She answered questions with a low, steady voice and admitted she had been an employee whose loyalty had been divided. The defense tried to paint her as resentful, as someone who wanted to hurt the family. They asked about her position, about pay, about whether she'd been disciplined. Camila answered honestly. She did not go to court to be heroic. She went because she had heard a sentence she could not unhear. The audio expert was not cinematic. He wore simple glasses and spoke in terms of waveforms and spectrograms. On the stand, he displayed the tape and a chart of patterns, the rise and fall of vowel sounds, a signature pattern in how Vanessa elongated the middle syllables of some words. The expert did not call the voice definitively Vanessa, in a way that made a courtroom believe he had conjured certainty out of fog. Instead, he testified to probability and context, that the match fell within a reasonable degree of confidence given the quality of the recording, and that when paired with other evidence, timestamps, Otis's recollection, Darnell's backup, the inferences a reasonable person could draw were strong. There was also the human element. Otis came forward with hands stained with the soil of the grounds, the kind of man who had learned to notice small things, how a hedgerow had been disturbed, how a broom had been angled differently. He told Detective Monroe that on the night in question, he had seen Vanessa, in a coat, carrying something wrapped in a blanket away from the lane. He had thought little of it then. Later, he thought of it as everything. The defense's playbook relied on disassembling trust. They suggested Darnell had motivations, that Camila had an agenda, that Otis's memory might be faulty. They tried to suggest that someone could have constructed a narrative to serve a resentful, opportunistic servant and her allies. It was a strategy that asked jurors to prefer plausibility of doubt to the discomfort of reckoning.
The prosecution had to surge over that strategy with stitches of its own: documentation, chain of custody, consistency across witness statements, and a focused narrative that respected the jury's need to know not only who might have wanted wrongdoing to be covered up, but who had acted to save a life and then to seek justice. In private, Maya worried less about the forensics than about what she might sound like in a room built to test truth in a way she had never been trained for. She practiced with Joel and Detective Monroe, reciting the night like a prayer. She did not want to be a spectacle. She wanted to be a woman describing what she had done: found a cry, warmed a small body, clung to a life. In her mind, she rehearsed small details that she had lived by: the texture of the blanket, the scent of rain, the weight of the elephant between her fingers.
Those details would be the ballast that made her memory feel anchored in reality rather than shaped by artifice. The press made a circus of the waiting. Cameras crowded the courthouse steps. Commentators reduced complex human motives into shrill summaries. The Harper PR machine responded with statements about privacy and cooperation, but also with a whisper campaign, doubt seeded in op-eds and in casual leaks. Why would someone unnamed place their hands on a family's child? What did that person want? The smear aimed to elicit a public reflex: assume the shadow is guilt. The machine had spent decades perfecting how to protect a face. Within the hush behind the courtroom doors, things moved more slowly. The judge ruled on the admissibility of the backup footage and the audio file, allowing both with precise instructions about how jurors could consider them. The defense pressed appeals, filed motions. There were hearing days that felt like small wars: citations, exhibits, legal arguments about the chain of custody, declarations about normal procedures. Each victory for the prosecution was small and necessary, a practical demonstration that process could protect truth. A pre-trial negotiation circled the edges. The Harpers' lawyers reached towards a settlement that might avoid public airing, a civil deal that might result in removal of charges in exchange for money and privacy. Thomas Harper, who had spent the weeks since the night like a man waking under a heavy truth, balked. He visited the hospital where the infant had been treated, spoke to pediatricians, and sat with a photo of Lorraine that had been left behind in one of the house drawers by the stake. The photograph, old and glancing, showed Lorraine in Harper's service dress beside a young Thomas in a garden, her hand on his arm in a gesture that suggested long familiarity more than servitude. It was not evidence of crime, but it carried weight. It suggested that the world had always been braided across the edges of power, families reliant on those they rarely named. Thomas found himself listening to versions of stories he had never been told. He began meeting secretly with Joel Bennett to understand the legal stakes, and with Detective Monroe to hear what the evidence suggested. His meetings were awkward at first. He had the manner of a man accustomed to solving for public relations rather than moral queries. The interviews had the flavor of a man learning humility. He told Maya once, quietly, and without the need for a PR consultant in the room, "I should have seen things differently." That admission did not absolve him. It did, in a legal sense, complicate his position. He could not fully displace the responsibility for Vanessa's choices. But the human effect was that Thomas's softening became a part of the public story later on. He began to ask that charges be pursued, not to punish, he said, but to make certain the truth came out and that the system measured itself honestly. When the DA filed formal charges, they were precise: child endangerment, neglect, and attempted homicide among the counts that bore the statute's weight. The indictment read like the law's plain arithmetic. For Maya, it was a relief, less because she wanted vengeance than because it meant the system had decided to treat the baby's abandonment as a matter requiring accountability, not a private family cleanup. Courtroom days are long and small. Maya learned the rhythms: the squeak of shoes on linoleum, the rustle of papers, the soft cough that a juror makes when they are trying to make sense of a life they did not live. Joel called witnesses in a quiet, steady way. He let Detective Monroe bring out the logbooks, the lab reports, and Darnell's affidavit. He saved Otis for a surprise that the defense could not anticipate. The gardener's testimony painted a picture of a hedgerow disturbed and a bundle carried by a slipper-footed woman with a scarf. The defense's effort to portray the night as confusion unraveled a little at a time. Vanessa Harper's cross-examination was a study in unraveling. She took the stand with mascara like armor. At first, she spoke with a practiced precision, statements polished in private counsel. But as the prosecution asked pointed questions about her whereabouts, about the tone of the recorded call, and about a series of small inconsistencies that stacked like sediment, a strain appeared. She grew tighter. Her answers became clipped. The defense tried to present her as a mother who panicked and made a terrible decision. They appealed to motives that might reduce criminality to tragedy.
The prosecution sought to show conscious acts of endangerment, a deliberate choice to place a child where more than accident could be suspected. At a critical point, Joel introduced a recorded therapy note, an entry by a social worker who had eavesdropped on a luncheon where Vanessa had made a flippant remark about getting rid of complications. It wasn't conclusive on its own, but as part of a mosaic, it increased the likelihood that the abandonment had not been random. Maya's own testimony was the heart of the case, not because the prosecution needed it so much, as because the truth she offered rewired what the public assumed. On the stand, she spoke of the sound, not a dramatic memory, but the intimate keening of a small throat trying to claim air. She described the texture of the blanket, the weight of the toy, the utter banality of a night worker's tasks splitting suddenly into a demand to rescue. She did not grandstand. She did not ask jurors to pity her. She told the story as a citizen with hands that had moved to keep another human being alive. "Did you take nursing steps before you acted?" Joel asked once, as if even small detail might matter. "I wrapped her in my coat," Maya said. "I tucked the blanket. I felt for a pulse. I went to the door, and I asked for help." Her voice stayed level. "I would do it again."
That simplicity carried. It was not a legal argument so much as a moral fact. In a courtroom where every word is tested for strategy, the fact that someone would reach into a trash bin to save a baby was itself persuasive. The defense sought to break her memory. They asked about the photograph of Lorraine, insinuating that Maya had motives tied to some imagined grievance. The question landed like a rake. Maya's answer brought it back to the human center. She had a photograph because it was her mother, not because it was a cudgel. She spoke of the family that pressed her into service and how she had learned care there. She spoke about being seen in the act of rescue and how surprising it was that that act had been reframed as an accusation. She did not let their innuendo reduce her to fury. When the prosecution played Camila's recorded call in court, Vanessa's face did something like unthread. The clip was private speech. It had a cadence of someone letting a secret exist in air. The voice on the tape was what it was, raw, frustrated, dangerous in its indifference. The court heard it in a hush. The defense argued that the recording was out of context and that emotional tone did not translate to criminal intent. The prosecution asked jurors to consider intent in light of action. One empties a child in a bin and hopes no one finds them, and the space between desire and deed thinned into culpability. The jury deliberated for less time than Maya expected, but long enough for each juror's life to influence the slow calculation. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom overflowed with a press that had learned favorites and judgments. Family members sat in polite rows. Thomas Harper, as the father, watched with a face that had changed from the first nights of instinct. He did not look triumphant. He looked chastened. Guilty on counts of child endangerment and attempted murder, the forewoman read. The words landed like a bell that marked a turn in a public story. Vanessa's lawyer said something in a low tone. Vanessa sat very still. For Maya, the verdict did not erase the undoing the family had tried to create. It didn't fix everything. It did mark a legal reckoning. Vanessa was taken away under guard. The press circled, opinions flared. But the legal system continued its slow, practical work. Sentencing, appeal windows, the mechanics of custody for a child whose biological ties now carried a new public definition. The DA moved quickly to petition for custody changes on behalf of the child. Temporary guardianship was the first step. Social services conducted background checks on Maya, not the casual ones that the Harpers had never experienced. This was scrutiny with warmth. Home visits, interviews, questions about finances and support networks. For once, the bureaucratic gaze was on the person who had been invisible, not only the family who had the resources to cushion scandal. Thomas Harper's presence in those hearings mattered.
He testified not as a man who could absolve his wife, but as someone who had learned that truth required accountability. He spoke of the cost of protecting image, of the dissonance of wealth when weighed against a child's life. His words did not erase the past, but they helped in the present. Family court required evidence of fitness. Maya showed a steady household anchored by Greta's willingness to provide a room and the community's support. There were character references. Otis, who spoke of her care for the garden and for neighborhood children. Darnell, who spoke of her relentless pursuit of the truth. Greta, who described the steady, practical woman who made soup and kept patchwork quilts sewn with care. The social worker saw the child's attachment. The pediatrician who had treated Ella testified to the bond that had formed in those early fragile days. The child who had once been hypothalamic now responded to Maya's touch with a specificity no one could fake. Temporary guardianship was granted to Maya while the legal processes in the criminal and family courts played out. It was not the end of the story. It was a fragile shelter.
There were home visits, court dates, hearings where the Harper's legal team would attempt narrow motions, and procedures that felt slow enough to stretch worry thin. But every visit Ella made to Maya's home brought more evidence of an attachment, a small hand reaching for a soap-scented sleeve, a sleep that found rest in a familiar chest. In the months after the verdict, Maya became something else in her neighborhood, a woman whose public name was attached to a child. She continued to do household work where it came, not because she needed the money so much as because the habits of care were fundamental to who she was. But she also began to receive invites, calls from groups that wanted to know how to help at-risk mothers, from churches that wanted to start drives for warm blankets, from a local pediatric clinic that wanted to launch outreach. The attention was not all flattering. There were those who still preferred simple narratives, and there were opportunists. But the community response, small and honest, nodded around Maya in a way that made stability possible. The formation of the Ella Initiative began as a conversation over Greta's kitchen table. Maya, Greta, Detective Monroe, Joel Bennett, and Thomas Harper sat with mugs and scraps of paper. Thomas surprised them by offering seed funding, not as a matter of image, but out of guilt he wanted to turn to constructive ends. "I don't want my family's name to be only a stain," he said. "I want it to be part of a solution." His voice was careful. Maya listened. She did not need his money to be the moral arbiter of her life. She needed resources to keep the idea alive. She accepted the support as a practical necessity, not as absolution.
The initiative's mission was practical: to create a hotline for at-risk mothers, to provide emergency shelters where infants would be safe and mothers could be counseled, to fund educational programs that would connect those in crisis with housing and childcare. The group also set up legal clinics for domestic workers, providing them with knowledge about rights and protections. They learned to draft grant proposals, to write bylaws, to set up board meetings. Slowly, the Ella Initiative grew from a goodwill notion into a real organization with a tax ID and a small rented office near the community center. Naming the initiative after the child felt right, in the way a wound sometimes finds the shape of healing. The name made a promise, one the board intended to keep, that a child would not be just an object of pity, but an emblem of change. Maya chairing the first meeting of the initiative felt both natural and unlikely. People who had only ever known invisibility learned how to sit at a table and make decisions that affected a whole neighborhood. The legal loop closed in stages. After lengthy hearings and with Thomas's cooperation, Maya's temporary guardianship became a petition for permanent guardianship. The court considered the child's best interest and the stability of the home environment. Vanessa's conviction and the record of her instability weighed heavily. Thomas's willingness to support the child's placement with Maya, both emotionally and financially, mattered. Social workers documented the child's attachment and the home environment's stability. The judge, in a hearing marked by a bureaucratic quiet that felt like mercy, granted Maya legal guardianship. It was not a moment of triumphal chanting. It was an official recognition that the truth Maya had insisted upon was the reality around which they could build a future. The naming ceremony was modest and fierce. On a late summer afternoon, in the small garden behind Greta's house, a handful of neighbors gathered. The sun made the small elephant on Ella's blanket gleam like a coin. Greta baked a cake that tasted like childhood, and the table was strewn with cloth bunking. Thomas stood at the edge of the gathering with a simple bouquet, his presence no longer defensive but aimed at repair. He did not stand at the center. That place belonged to Maya. Maya wrapped Ella in the old knitted blanket, now washed and carefully mended, and placed the little elephant toy in the child's palm. She spoke, not with grand rhetoric, but with the authority of someone who had kept a life alive. "We will call you Ella," she said, and the syllable felt like a knot tied between past and future. "Because you made us look, because you made us act like a city that sees better, we will keep you warm." They read a child-friendly declaration that had been drafted by a volunteer lawyer, promises of care, obligations of community, and a vow to advocate for mothers in crisis.
People who had once been silent about the estate now spoke about how to create systems so that infants were not abandoned in darkness. Time's gauzy hand smoothed some sharp edges but left honest scars. The Harper family reconfigured itself. Thomas, who had been bereft and defensive in equal measure, began to fund programs and to lend his influence to municipal initiatives aimed at protecting vulnerable children. Mila, Vanessa's older daughter, who had been stunned by the revelation of her mother's actions, leaned toward Ella in ways that surprised many. She became an older sister who taught Ella to trace the veins on a leaf and to stack blocks with wild concentration. Her relationship with Maya began frayed, but mended into a respectful distance that eventually warmed. Not everything was healed. Not all relationships returned to what they had been, but some were repaired enough to be functional and human. Vanessa's sentence was measured by statute and the judge's discretion. She served time with access to counseling and supervised contact plans that were designed to protect the child while recognizing the complexity of human frailty. The law did what it could within its limits. It did not make redemption automatic, nor did it erase the harm. Those things remain the work of years. Over time, the Ella Initiative established a small shelter and a hotline that connected with local hospitals. Greta volunteered as the first cook. Darnell worked as head of facilities for the initiative after his job at the Harpers was gone. Otis took shifts in garden therapy. Camila enrolled in a community college course on nonprofit management and later took a paid role organizing outreach. The initiative's first grant came from a coalition of small donors and a surprising community fundraising push. People who had read about Ella's rescue felt a small moral compulsion to act. Their donations purchased cribs and warm blankets, and those purchases were a kind of practical justice. Maya's life settled into a rhythm she had not known she had the right to claim. Mornings were for school runs to a nearby community preschool, where Ella, now toddling and noisy, delighted in discovery. Days were for running the initiative, meeting with caseworkers, answering calls on the hotline, doing outreach in shelters, filing grant documents, and sometimes folding laundry in the quiet hours when the world felt like it could be held together by small domestic acts. At night, she would sit in the same window with the city lights and think of Lorraine's photograph on the mantel, its edges softened by time, and feel a steady kinship with a woman who had taught her how to fold a perfect cuff.
There were moments that felt almost absurd in their love. Ella's first scraped knee and the way Maya's voice could turn a cry into a giggle with a bandage and the story. A library afternoon where Ella traced the elephant in a book and then the toy elephant in her lap. A quiet Tuesday where Maya enrolled in a night class to learn nonprofit governance to be better at the initiative's formal demands. She was no longer merely surviving, she was building. Years condensed into a series of small, luminous seconds. The initiative grew in measured steps. A second staff member, a mobile unit, partnerships with hospitals to keep welfare checks discreet and supportive rather than punitive. The community who had once watched from the boundary began to show up in acts large and small. Donated winter coats, babysitting offers, volunteer tutors. What had begun as a crisis became a civic project. Thomas Harper's transformation was not cinematic. He made public statements about accountability and then quietly met with city leaders to encourage the creation of a municipal fund for emergency childcare. He supported the initiative's efforts with resources and contacts, and when journalists tried to paint him as the hero of a story that had not started with him, he refused the spotlight. He would, in private, come to Maya's meetings, not to instruct, but to listen. That plurality of roles, of father, of wealthy man, of ally, was messy and real. On the 5th anniversary of the night the cry was heard, the initiative hosted a small community fair. There were games, hot dogs, a table with copies of parenting resources, a photo booth where volunteers held up banners that read, simply, "Seen." Maya walked around with Ella, no longer a baby, but a bright child with unruly curls and a fierce curiosity. People came up and hugged her, some with tears, some with practical offers of help. A reporter asked her, on the edge of the fair, whether she had any regrets. "Only that a child ever needed someone like me to step in," Maya said, and her answer was the kind that did not ask for applause. "I wish the world had been kinder before the small things had to become public tragedies." The initiative's success was not total. There were bureaucratic entanglements and funding slumps, disagreements about governance, and the constant difficulty of meeting the needs of those who had been failed by systems meant to protect. But there was also a steady accumulation of small triumphs. A mother connected to housing, an infant given a warm crib, a hotline call that stopped a dangerous plan in its tracks. Those were the measures of the work. One quiet evening much later, Maya stood by the window, closing the day. Ella slept in a bed the size of a small boat, a new elephant nightlight on the shelf throwing a soft glow across a familiar blanket. The photograph of Lorraine rested on a shelf next to a framed copy of a document listing the initiative's founding donors.
Maya touched the creased edge of the old photo. It felt like a conversation across time. Her mother's hand, gone now, and the life that had been stitched into Maya's own by lineage and love. There were moments when she remembered the shed's cold concrete and the damp bench where she had pressed Lorraine's photograph until it warmed, the same way she remembered a child's tiny hand clamped to her finger in the hospital, and the shiver of breath that made the air thin and sacred. Those images were there not to shame, but to keep the memory honest. They were directions, a map toward who she wanted to be in the world. Outside the window, the city moved at its habitual pace, a bus cough, a distant siren, the murmur of late-night diners. Inside, the house smelled of soup and paper and a quiet that belonged to people who had worked and argued and slept and loved across long hours. Maya lowered the blanket over Ella and smoothed its knitted folds, checking that the elephant toy was tucked in at the child's side. She had been called many things: maid, rescuer, activist, guardian. The title the world had given her was not the thing that defined her. What defined her was the act that had set everything in motion, placing a human life against her own and refusing to let the world label it away. She had stepped into visibility and then built from there. A life, a nonprofit, a family that was chosen with the force of intention. There was no grand final scene, no trumpet fanfare. Transformation is often quiet, an accumulation rather than an explosion. The Harper estate still stood, but its hedgerows no longer hid the story that had moved through them. The initiative that bore Ella's name did not solve every injustice. It made a few things less likely to happen again. Maya stood with the photograph of Lorraine resting in the pocket of her jacket and looked at her sleeping child. The small elephant's embroidered eye caught the lamp's light and seemed to blink. She pressed a hand flat against her palm, feeling the pulse beneath, the same pulse that, years before, had heard a cry and answered. If this story moved you, if the stubbornness of tending to another human being matters, learn more about organizations that support at-risk infants and mothers. There's a link in the description with ways to help and to volunteer. The child who was once hidden in a trash bin now sleeps in a home made by hands that chose to see. The woman who found her kept seeing, and through seeing, she changed everything.